There is no growth in comfort and no comfort in growth. Yet the big leaps are how careers are made and how businesses excel. So how do you master not knowing it all or feeling like an imposter? How do you have the conversations that will lead to trust and, of course, excellence? How do you take charge of the things that you can control? How do you thrive outside your comfort zone? That's what this podcast is about. I'm your host, Wanda Wallace, and it's time to get out of the comfort zone. Welcome to the conversation. I think every single organization I speak to wants its leaders to be more flexible. Now, pick your words du jour. It may be agile, it may be versatile, adaptable, flexible. The latest one I heard is anti-fragile. Whatever it is, everybody is wanting people to be more of that thing, whatever word you want to choose. The word we're going to choose for today is flexible. But what on earth does that mean? What are we supposed to be doing when we're flexible and not flexible? How do we get to that state of being? What behaviors do we adopt and focus on? And how do you change your mindset and, more importantly, your habits so that you are seen as a more flexible leader? So my guest today is Kevin Eikenberry. Kevin is the Chief Potential Officer of the Kevin Eikenberry Group, which is a leadership and learning laboratory or company based in Indianapolis in the U.S., with a team scattered across the U.S., and he's spent over 30 years helping organizations and leaders from at least 53 companies become more effective. People call him one of the most influential thinkers on leadership for the last many years. They say 3 years, but I think it's many years. His blog is at thekevineikenberry.com/blog, and his podcast, remarkablepodcast.com. He's got a host of books, but the book we're talking about today is Flexible Leadership: Navigate Uncertainty and Lead with Confidence. Something we all definitely need. Kevin, welcome to the conversation. Pleasure to have you here.
Wanda, it's a pleasure to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Well, you're in that rare set. I think you're a three-peat now. So there are not very many who've done more than one. So welcome to a rare club here. So why this book? You talk about what it takes to be a remarkable leader. That's what your other books have been about. Why this book?
Well, the subtitle says Navigate Uncertainty and Lead with Confidence. And so we're going to obviously talk about flexibility, but let's go to that word uncertainty, because in a world that's more uncertain than ever, let's just do this real quick. Let's think of any of you as you're listening to us. You think about how you were leading 5 years ago. You were leading the best you could lead. We'll just say 5 because it was right before the pandemic, right? You were leading the best you knew how. You're doing the best you could, and chances are you're doing pretty well. If you're listening to this, you're a student of leadership. You're probably above the average, but you knew then you could have gotten better, right? Now, let's say that you didn't change. 5 years have passed. Do you think that the new normal has moved in the direction of your particular approach? Probably not. So, and we're not even really just talking about sort of moving with the trend. That's really even not what we're talking about at all. But just to make the point of, like, man, if we're not adjusting in the big picture, we probably have a challenge. But really the big idea of this book is, how do I adjust in the moment? How do I flex in the moment to better match the context of the situation in which I'm leading?
Right. Well, this is something, I know you and I have talked about in the past, and we both believe about leadership, is that there's a bunch of polarities. And you're always sort of trying to manage one polarity or the other. That is just the nature of leadership. And I think that's what you mean by flex in the moment. But I also agree with you, and I don't want to say, I don't want to use the word VUCA ever again because I've heard it too many times. So let's just leave that one aside.
I only said it one time in the entire book.
I got it. I saw that.
It was near the end.
I really appreciated that one too, because I am tired of hearing the word. The description of it doesn't help me deal with it. But the truth is, the volume of work, the pressure that people are feeling from that volume of work and from the importance of that volume of work, I think is unprecedented in what people are seeing today. So the ability to pivot has never been more critical.
And even though that's true, and I think every leader will agree with that, and yet most aren't doing anything about it. That's the thing. we think that's a good idea, everyone will nod their head in a workshop and they're driving down the road as they're listening to us right now and go, yep, that's right, Wanda's got it. But then the question that I would ask you is, are you doing it? And the answer is most aren't.
Well, Kevin, to your point, the reason I think most aren't is they don't know what it looks like. Like, what does it mean I'm supposed to be doing? Where's my checklist on what I'm supposed to be doing to see if my intent is to be flexible, but it isn't coming across that way. So let's do that one. What do you mean by flexibility?
I mean, being able to consider the situation that we're in, or what I would call the context that we're in, and then making a conscious choice about how I want to lead in that moment, which might not be my natural response. It might not be what I believe my style is. It might not be what strengths I supposedly have. It might not be my Myers-Briggs or DISC style. Like, all of those things are useful, but whether it's our habit, it's our style, or our approach, or any of those things, like, the point is, flexible leadership is about looking at the situation intentionally and saying, what will get us the best results right now? Which is not always, sometimes, but not always going to be what we naturally do or like to do. Let's take a very super easy example, right? Like, something comes in and you decide you're going to send an email to someone because that's what you are used to doing. That's what you naturally do. You like email. But what if you stopped for a second and said, well, email, maybe I should pick up the phone. Maybe I should send them a Slack or a Teams message. Maybe I should walk down the hallway. Maybe I should get them on a Zoom. Like, it might be as simple as that. Like, what's the best way in that moment for me to get my message received? And that is an ultra simple example, but I think for our purposes of understanding where we're headed, it's a useful one.
Okay. I see this in a more complex way. Let's take something we all love, like emotional intelligence, and I need to respond with emotional intelligence to somebody's behavior or action or whatever. All right, to do that well, I can't just respond the way I would normally respond to that. Even if I am the manager, I got to stop and think, what is that really about for me? Where is this person? What else might be going on? What are my possibilities? That's another version of what you mean by flexible in the moment. Yeah.
100%. Like, and more, like, what's my relationship with that person? How long have they been here? What's the comfort level? What's our trust level between us? Like you said, what else is going on in their life? Do we even know what's else is going on in their life? How many other projects that they're on, like 10% of their time? And all of that stuff, all of that is what I call the context. What does the context tell us? And we never look at the context if we go on our autopilot. We do what we would do. And that's exactly right.
All right. So I must then, if I know what I'm describing this as, I have to understand what my autopilot is to begin with. I have to know where the switch is to turn it on or off. I have to then ask, what are the options in this situation? And then what's the action that's going to get me to the best possible outcome in this situation?
100%. Like, you should have written the book. Like, you've got it. That's it.
I can describe it. Getting people to do it is a whole other thing. All right. Okay,
well, so can we talk about that for a second?
Yeah.
Because I know that you told me before we started where we're going to head, the arc of our conversation. Here's the thing: getting people to do it, and let's just talk about rather than me coaching someone else. Like, let's just talk about all of us as individual leaders. So I'm now talking to all of you listening as, how do I do it? Right? What do I need to do? And it has to start with the mindset that there's more to me as a leader than my strengths or my style. Those things are useful. People that Wanda and I know have built these models, and they've been around, and they're tremendously valuable and useful until they're not. And when they're not useful is when we take them as our identity. So we're taking a model which is already a simplified version of the real world, meant to give us some clarity and perspective. And then we're simplifying it more by calling ourselves, we have these 3 strengths, or I'm a facilitative leader, or I've got this set of letters or colors that represent who I am. And we are oversimplifying the complexity of the world to the point that we now say, well, the worst goal of this is the person says, well, this is the way I lead, like, take it or leave it. They use it as the excuse for their approach. We can't end up there. And yet way more leaders are there
Well,
than imagine.
Rob Kaiser's work will show this more than anything else to anybody, to me, is we always take our strengths and we always say play to our strengths. Okay. So I'm an extroverted leader. I will always be an extroverted leader. It is one of my strongest skills and it's not going to change. It's not going away. That will be part of me. But I will play it to the point of fault. So it's knowing when to pull back from that. Yes, it is me. Yes, it is part of my identity. Yes, that's true. But it can't be all of me. I have to have some other things that I can tap into as well.
And I can't be, so everything you were saying was perfect for a while, right? Like I'm an expert leader, knowing that useful, right? Like that's my general natural approach. Wonderful. Knowing that, awesome. Then the problem comes, and that's how I lead. No, that's where you got to stop. That's when you've got to say, well, when would it serve me, others, and the outcomes better if maybe I was a little more introverted here, right? If maybe I just stepped back a little longer. If maybe I sat at a different place at the table in the meeting. Like, I mean, I could go right on down the list of 100 things, right? Like, and that just means we've got to start by saying, in this situation, right? Maybe it's fine for you to be an extroverted leader on your team of peers, but maybe with your team, you need to dial that back because you have a whole team of introverted folks, or you've got a whole bunch of extroverted folks, and now it becomes almost like a shouting match. Like we've just got to be thinking about all of this, and that's really a big in this book.
All right. I like that. And we can talk about that at the individual leader level. We can talk about it at the individual personality trait level. We can talk about it at the habit level. But you can also talk about it in terms of the big strategic level as well. So, I think the way to growth is this path, but it's being open to, is that the only way to get the growth, or is there something else that I'm missing in this moment at this period of time? Okay. I want to ask you about a challenge. A pondering challenge I have always on this question of flexibility. So when we look at flexibility, agility, resilience, put in whatever your favorite word in that is, what we see is that some systems, whether they're human systems or biological systems or organizational systems, when faced with an obstacle, do best by just charging ahead, grit. Don't change, don't deviate. Persistence is the answer. And some systems, some people, some contexts, so on, do better by being able to change with the wind. So that isn't working fine, let's pivot. The question is, how the heck do we know when I'm supposed to persist and when I'm supposed to bend?
So in the book, I've leaned into the work of Dave Snowden, and he and others, but he's the original initiator of this thing called the Cynefin framework. And he typically has used it to look at uncertainty and big picture sorts of things, really strategic stuff, big stuff. And what I've tried to do is apply it in a more immediate, personal, ongoing sort of way. And basically, here's the idea. Like if I put you out in the wilderness and I say, your job is to get out. Well, the first thing you would say to me is, well, where's my map? And so the Cynefin framework is the map that I'm suggesting we use to have a sense of the context that we are in, right? And so whether to use the example you're describing, like should we persist, should we lean into grit, or should we shift, pivot, etc., depends a lot on what's the context of this situation, right? If the situation is clear, where the knowns are known, where the cause and effect are known, where even we know that maybe as a leader or as a team collectively, like we have the answers, like then we can probably just persist. We can keep trying. We'll probably work through it. We'll probably there are best practices. There are processes we can follow. We can dive into Lean and Six Sigma. We can figure it all out. Awesome. And that's all really, really good, but the whole world is not that. Like the whole world is not that. So there are 4 in this framework, there are 4 domains, if you will: clear, complicated, complex, and chaotic. And most of you are saying, oh yeah, well, Kevin, if we're not in clear, well, we're in chaos. Like my organization is in chaos all the time. And I would suggest to you, based on the framework, not really very often. Like we used to live in clear, and we still have some stuff that's clear. And occasionally we're in chaos. Like I happen to be in a client location today in Houston. And so here's an example of chaos. If all of a sudden here comes a hurricane, and I work in a plant of some sort, like a whole bunch of, like we don't know when it's going to hit, where it's going to hit, how it's going to hit us, what it's going to mean, but we have to make decisions right now. And in that moment, as the leader, people are looking just like someone decide something. They're wanting us to do that. We need something so that we can move from there. That is not really very often where we are. Where we are most of the time, I would propose, are in those complicated and complex frames or domains. And in the book, we try to talk a little bit more about what all of them look like and how do we flex based on where we are. So back to grit versus pivot, right? What does the context tell me? Right? And the other thing I would say about that is to look at context means we have to step back and look up, right? I often tell leaders that as leaders, we need to have a bird's eye view of things, which means if a bird is looking at a forest, they can see all these individual trees, how they're connected, how they are situated, and what they are. But if you're a worm, and I am not suggesting that your individual contributors are worms, but if you're a worm and you're looking at the same tree that the bird is looking at, it looks very different to you. And as leaders, we have to help our teams by lifting our view so we can help them see something. And the idea of sense making is in part about looking enough to see, like, where are we really? Then we can decide. Like, and it's even, it's not grit or pivot, it's how much grit and how much pivot. Like that's not one of the flexors in the book. But I say in the book that, and we list 19 of these, and I say once you get this, you'll see them everywhere, right? So we end up asking ourselves questions all the time as if in false dichotomies, as are we going to do this or are we going to do this? When the right answer is how much of each do we need to do? Which direction should we lean? Which might not be where we would naturally want to lean.
Yeah, I like that. How much of each do we need? Because at some point in the day, they have to be in some order of balance, I believe.
Yeah. It's a both and world, not an either or world. And so that means, are we supposed to be consistent or are we supposed to be flexible? Yes. Do we need compliance or commitment? Well, most people say, well, I want commitment. And I would say, well, there are times all you need is compliance. And if you try to get commitment, 100% commitment all the time, it's not going to be your best option. You may not need that. And so we can have a lean, but what does the situation tell us will serve us, our teams, and our outcomes best?
It reminds me of Phil Hodgson, Randy White's old definition of leadership. It's trying to get the best possible results in the shortest amount of time with the greatest acceptance. It's kind of like that constant compromise solution that I think is, it's where you're driving at. What is it in this situation that's going to get us the closest to where we need to be with the most people on board with it?
So the way I would frame that, rather than compromise, is manage the tension. Right? I mean, we're saying the same thing, but I think language matters, right? So what I would say is there's a tension between, and my words here would be outcomes and others. There's a tension between the outcomes we want to achieve and those who are doing it and how we support them and have them, all that. Like there's a tension. There's always a tension between those things. And much of the conversation about, for example, where people are working now, and all of the iterations of that we've had since the pandemic has all been about a tension between outcomes and others. And so the question is, where do we lean? Recognize that both of those are important.
Yep. Okay.
That's the essence of this book.
Great. All right. I want to know more about the flexors. But how do you get somebody to the place? So there's the first recognizing the tension that exists, so that either ends. But how do you get somebody to a place where they are prepared to say, yes, I might naturally lean towards the outcome. How am I going to lean a little more towards the others or the other side of this tension? Is it just a matter of recognizing it, or are there other steps in this process?
Well, the biggest piece of it at the end of the day is recognizing that that's even desirable, right? So we go way back to the beginning, right? If I see the world as either or, if I see the world through the lens of this is my strengths or this is my style, like if you were there, none of the rest of this conversation is going to matter, because they're like, this is what I do, this is the way I do it, this is what I've been successful doing, and for the most part, I'm not going to deviate from that. I'm working on habit, automatic pilot, system one thinking, whatever you want to call it. And so the first thing is recognizing that the world isn't as simple, that the world of work isn't as simple as a machine, and that there's not just a machine thinking way to think about it, but there's an organism way of thinking, a biology way of thinking about it. Like, it's that, and it's really realizing that the world is more likely more complicated and complex than we'd like it to be. So it's like, I may not like that, but that is like, we have to sort of say, yep, that's the world. Because if people's mindset doesn't get there, none of the rest of this conversation is going to matter, right? So I'm suggesting that we have, as complex as leadership already is, that I'm suggesting that getting better at it requires us to make some hard choices at the beginning, which is to at least ask ourselves, is my natural response, as we've talked about several times, the best option for me?
I always say to people, Kevin, when I'm talking about leadership, especially with a large group, I'll say that whatever great quality you think is really important, I promise you there are occasions where you need to do the opposite. So when somebody says a list to you of these are the qualities, I want you to look at occasions where the opposite is actually really relevant. And we're saying the same thing. I like your notion of managing the tension.
Exactly what we're saying, right?
Right.
Like, I want to lead. I want to be a leader that creates commitment. Awesome. Sometimes compliance is all you need, right? There's this. That's exactly it. Our greatest strengths. Another way of saying it. Our greatest strengths can be our biggest weaknesses or blind spots. And so it's the idea of living at the ends of the flexor, that the ends of I'll give you another example. I've done this exercise with hundreds of groups. Ask them to say, what are some of the biggest mistakes that new leaders make when they're leading a team? They could be the first time leader or they're leading a new team. And guess what? Two things that almost always show up. Well, they come in and they change too much too fast, or they come in and don't change anything. Well, those are two ends of the same flexor, right? And we can all nod our head and say, yeah, the far end of those are not likely right. The context of the situation, how the team is doing, what's the competitive situation, 100 other things might have us leaning toward more or less change in that setting. But the mistake is at the ends.
Yeah.
Right.
All right. So we're back to a balancing act, a balancing of the tension between two things. All right. So Kevin, we've talked about understanding the intention. My intention is to recognize that there is not an either or, there's an and. And even though one feels natural to me, I may well need to lean in the opposite direction to get the best outcome. We've talked about the context and whether the context is clear, complicated, complex, or chaotic, recognizing most of the time it's the two middle, complicated or complex, okay? Now, and you've mentioned this notion of flexors, and we've talked about a couple of them. All right, so help me understand the flexors, or some of them at least, and what do I do about them?
Well, yeah, we have mentioned several of them, right? And we've mentioned this idea, and this is where that tension lies, right? So are we leaning toward outcomes or others? Are we leaning toward compliance or commitment? And so too much change, not enough change. Like, all of those are examples of flexors. And so the idea is, what's the tension? What's my natural reaction? What would I do without thinking? And then what does the context tell me now is going to get us the best results, right? So that's why the three things, you've unpacked them in order: intention plus context plus flexor, flexible leadership, right? So the idea, I think we've talked about the idea pretty clearly here, that whichever one of these flexors that you might be talking about, there's the ends, the extreme ends are rarely the best answer, the right answer. Somewhere in between. It might be really close to one or really close to the other. It's probably not all the way. Call it balancing, call it managing tension, call it whatever you would want. We call them flexors so that we can adjust, flex, to meet the context and give us the best chance of results.
Okay. All right. So I want you to just run through, like, you have this lovely long list of flexors in the book. I think you've said 19, and we've talked about 3 or 4 of them. Just give me a sample of what other kind of flexors you describe in the book.
Well, I'll give you one that sometimes I think gives people pause. And that one is what I call the truth and grace flexor. Right? So this is more nuanced than some of the others that we've talked about, and even some of the others in the book. So there are times when there are facts and there are logic and like, here's what we need to do. And I need to give you feedback on this because here were the results. And yet there are times when perhaps we need to give people a little grace, or we need to give ourselves a little grace. And there may be truth. And in fact, I would say that the best model of this ever was Jesus Christ. And he was like that. It's both. It's not one or the other. It's both. And you don't have to have my belief there to follow this flexor. The idea of this flexor is where is the person, or where am I? And we can't ignore the truth for sure. But right now, is that more important, so I have a team member who lost her daughter last summer in a car accident. Okay. So I think it's safe to say that the better answer for me was to lean more towards grace with her for some period of time. And I think that's a big example. And most people say, well, sure. But yet we probably all know leaders that's sort of like, okay, I got past the funeral. We're going to go right back to where we normally are. And I would suggest, for me, in our situation, that wasn't necessarily what I chose to do. I flexed. It was the best approach to meet the needs of our team and of the member of our team. And so that's an extreme example, but it gives you an example of thinking, what's the situation telling me? My dad would have said, don't check your brain at the door. But if we only go on autopilot, we sort of are checking our brain at the door. We're not using our brain. We're just doing what comes automatically.
Right. I'm thinking about a leader that I have just recently coached, where there's a division underneath her that, and she's made some very clear rules about how each of these divisions are going to operate and not operate. Okay? Very, very clear rules with good reason and with good intention. But there's one division that can't quite meet those for legitimate, verifiable reasons. And it's not like there was a personal tragedy. It has to do with the physicality and location. Okay? All right? And it's legitimate. So now, do you
and the leader you're coaching recognizes that legitimacy?
Yes, recognize that legitimate. Struggled with but I set the boundary on the truth side. This was it. No, I'm not letting other people off the hook, et cetera, et cetera. Knowing at the same time that some grace was needed, and struggled to square those two. Like, if I give grace here, am I expected to give grace in every situation?
And I can't do that. I got to hold the line. Like,
exactly.
Now you all are hearing the tension here, right? Keep going.
Right. So with this particular leader, what the conclusion came down to is that grace was justifiable. And grace was justifiable because there are extenuating circumstances. And that you would apply those extenuating circumstances to another division struggling with the exact same kind of parameters. So it is,
It's
yes,
different
I'm
than they're
still
just not
holding.
making the number, right?
Exactly, exactly. Or they're not doing it the way I laid out that they were going to do the path, or they're not on deadline the way I laid out that they would be on deadline. I mean, a whole host of decisions you can imagine that you've made for a variety of reasons. Any rate, it's the stopping to reconsider. And I would not argue in this place that either side was the ultimate answer. I just think you have to pause and say, is it the truth side or the grace side?
And here's the thing, and that's a great example. Here's the thing. This is nuance. And so many leaders like, well, just tell me what to do. Like they'll come to us, you'll come to you or to me, or you as a leader will have people come to you and say, just tell me what you want. And you can say, well, I could just tell them, right? But that might even be what they're asking for. But the other end of that flexor is asking, or the other end of that flexor is discovery. And so, that example is such a good one. And we don't have to know, and none of us have to know any more than what you shared with us for us to see it and to feel it. And what I want to say to everyone there, and I'm really glad now that I picked that one because you shared a really good example. The thing I would say is you don't have to apologize for flexing. And not everyone might 100% understand it. But you do owe it to folks to help them see a little bit about how you're making the sausage, right? A little bit about the thought process. Because here's what happens when you do that. You build trust. You build trust with the team because they realize, even if maybe they don't love that, if they're in one of the other divisions that's not getting any grace, they will come to realize that you are being thoughtful, you are being intentional, and that you really do want great results with and through others, right? That to me, that's my definition of leadership: reaching valuable outcomes with and through others. And so that example is showing that. And us being willing to flex, there are leaders that say, well, people just want me to be consistent. I said, no, what people want you to do is be real. And there are things to be consistent on, and there are a whole bunch of things that we can flex on, the kind of things that we've been talking about today.
Right. Well, one of the things that I said to this leader is, whatever you do, you have stood in your entire turnaround of this business on transparency. So you have got, whatever decision you make, you've got to be transparent about why you've made that decision, and willing to entertain transparency from other places where that might be appropriate. Like, if that because I would argue in her particular circumstances, that moves the entire organization 2 steps closer to where she wanted to be, as opposed to the resistance and the insistence and the, we fall short of it. Okay. At any rate, I can give you another one. I don't know if this is, I don't know all of your 19 in your book. I've read some of them. I'm super impressed with a long list of them because there's quite a few in there and they're pretty powerful ones. But another one that I see routinely is this notion of the flex between, am I going to insist on having it the way I want it to have it? Or am I going to let somebody else win one? And it might not be ideal, but I'm going to let them feel good about the win.
Well, here's the thing. There's a lot of things that are subjective at the end of the day, right? And so are we going to say that like there are lots of us as leaders, and probably all of us listening at some time or other have done this, like there's a right way and it's the way I do it. Like I've done this 112 times. And so that's how I want you to do it, right? And I want to say 2 things lovingly to everyone who's listening. One is, I'm going to start by saying this. When you first learned it, you now do it differently than when you first learned it. And if you force people to do it your way, there's no chance for further improvement. So that's the first thing I'll say. And the second thing I'll say is that in a world that isn't just black and white, clear context, right? There are a range of possible answers, right? Like we don't want someone else to take an approach that's going to make someone unsafe, do something illegal, do something immoral. Like obviously there are some boundaries here, but at some level, and we need to provide a safety net psychologically and physically for people around this. So we don't want them to fail, and failure shouldn't be fatal. I don't, literally or figuratively, obviously. But my point is that we have to let go if we want things to get better. And the other thing I will say is the longer it's been since you were in that spot, the less likely all of your expertise is perfectly valid anymore. That was hard for us all to take.
That is hard for us to take because it's years of developing that expertise. And so, wow.
I know, but that's what we hold on to. And in many cases, that's why we got promoted.
That's why we're in the seat we're in. It's because that experience, that track record.
Or at least that's what we think. That's what we have in our head. So how could we let go of that? And I'm saying maybe sometimes you can't, and I'll even be very tactical now. Like if you are going to delegate something to someone, which is fundamentally what we're talking about here, what most of us do is say, I need you to do this, and you do it. You do this, you do the 7 things. And you give them the how expectation, which is exactly how you do it. But if instead you would start with the what expectation, what is this? And the why expectation, here's how this fits into something bigger, bird's eye view. And the who expectation, who's going to use the output of this work? If they have those 3, guess what they're naturally going to say? Wanda, what's the best way for me to do this? But if we start with, here's what I need you to do this, and this, these 3 people, these 3 times, then all I'm doing is trying to make sure I get down exactly what Wanda said, and there's no way I can succeed as well as you have, because you've done it 641 times.
Right, and I say there's no way I remember. If you're telling me to do that, there's no way I remember what you said. Then I'm just trying to follow rules, and that doesn't work. Right? It just doesn't work.
And there's another level to that too, because you've done it so many times that there's stuff that you just know, like the profound knowledge stuff that you don't even say. And then when people don't do it the way you want it, we're like, well, why didn't they do that? Well, if we give them the why up front and they've got that bigger picture, then they're more likely to say, oh yeah, there's a gap. I don't quite know why she did that, but now I can either figure it out or I can ask her. But if you just give me the list of steps, even if we're talking about a senior leader, if all you do is give me steps, I'm missing so much about how I can bring who I am and my expertise and my commitment to the table.
Right. Kevin, I can't resist. I had a funny personal story recently. So there's a Japanese friend here in New York City who always wanted to learn to bake a cake. She sees baking a cake from scratch as this big, enormous task that is way beyond her capability.
We're not talking about starting with a box. We're talking about
just the ingredients. The flour, eggs, sugar, the whole thing, right? From scratch. I grew up with this. This is what we always did. Like how hard is baking a cake? You follow a recipe. It says 1, 2, 3, 4, and it's written down for you. The sequence you do it in, the quantity you do it. It's as detailed as you can get. Kevin, I start with this, guiding her through the recipe, and realize there's 20 things that are left out that I just have as tacit knowledge. I hadn't even thought. Oh, right, you're right. When you measure a cup full, you have to level it, not heap it. It's not written in it, but it's true. Anytime, this is a trivial, crazy example.
No, it's a perfect example, because that's the stuff. There's 20 things that we just know that how could they know? That's it. It's a perfect example, actually. I'll probably steal it. It's a perfect example.
Exactly. But I go to do something that I've done so many, many times, especially in our work worlds that are way more complicated than making a cake. And the instructions are never as clear. And by the way, they've changed 15 times since the instructions were written down anyway. And then, so I need people to be able to think their way through it.
And the context may have changed since you last did it. And so even if you give them everything perfectly how you did it, again, if it's not a clear context, that best practice still may not quite be right. So I used to do this exercise in workshops where I've done it for different purposes, where I give everybody bread, a knife, a plate, peanut butter, jelly, and I say your job is to make a set of instructions to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Well, first of all, not everyone in the group can decide how to do it because they all have a different way of doing it. And so that's the first lesson, which is, again, so like if there's 5 ways, does it have to be cut? Does it have to be cut diagonally? Do you have to put the peanut butter on one side and the jelly on the other? Some of those things are personal preferences, and it goes back to our earlier point, like maybe it just doesn't matter. Do you have to wipe off the knife before? Can you put the peanut buttered knife into the jelly? Some people are like, no. Some people are like, who cares? Like, some people care. And like, where are those boundaries, and where are those, like, just let people make a sandwich?
Yeah.
Good.
We're going off track here. I have an exercise I've done with teams for years where one group has a set of blocks, a puzzle thing, and they have to write instructions for the other group to put the puzzle together. Okay, classic example.
Same thing.
It's never clear.
They have to take the instructions and they can't make a sandwich. They want to make their own list. Follow these instructions exactly, and you get some sandwich. You don't get a sandwich.
Oh, but
you get a jar of peanut butter sitting between 2 pieces of bread.
We could talk about this one for forever. All right, so let me come back to our key point here on this one, Kevin. Is the notion is that wherever my preferences lie as a leader, whatever I feel like is right, there is another end of that flexor that I want to consider. I want to start by looking at, and I have to have the intention that there could be a better alternative in this situation, in this context. I'm looking at the context in terms of how clear is it, how complicated is it, how complex it is, how chaotic it is, using Snowden's original architecture on that one. The more we go up that scale, the more flexibility I probably need. Can debate about that one as well.
Well, but I guess we just say, like, if it's a clear context, and if you've had general success as a leader, you probably won't mess it up too bad if it's in clear. But it's in the others where it really begins to be a challenge.
Well, it's also true in chaos. Sometimes we don't care, just make a decision. Any decision moves us forward, and it almost doesn't matter which one. So when you use that example at the very beginning.
We can't stay there forever.
Right.
Right?
We can't. We hope to get back to complicated or complex, but at any rate, in the complex and complicated, I'd swear I've got to be most careful about looking at the flexors. That there are lots of these flexors where the point is to balance the tension between the two and to say where on this flexor is the best place for me to be for the people, for the results, and given what my bias is naturally towards doing.
Yeah. And listen, sometimes your natural bias, natural tendency, auto response is going to be just fine, right? And sometimes it's not. And that's where we need to be able to flex.
That's where we need to be flexible. Okay. All right. And a lot of this is an intention and it's a habit. So give me like 2 or 3 tips to make this a more effective habit.
Well, we all know, we've learned a lot as humans. I mean, societally, we've learned a lot about habits in the last 15, 20 years, and there's been some great books written about it, including James Clear, who I reference in the book. If you haven't read Atomic Habits, you should, because it is clearly the best-selling book on this whole area. It's not the only one. It's excellent. There are others that are also good. The point here is we have to know what's the cue that says maybe I want to do something different, right? And then there's several steps after that. But that's why, for our purposes, I would just say this. If we get the intention right to say that maybe sometimes I need to at least take a breath, take a second, and ponder before I move forward. I'm not suggesting that every time something comes up that you're going to take a day to analyze it. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying, are we able to stop long enough to say, is this going to be fine? Or might there be unintended consequences here and that I need to think about a little differently? And one of the things, so here's the way I would say it. If you're thinking about what's the best way to do this, and your answer is, well, it depends. If the answer in your head is, it depends, stop. What does it depend on? And then adjust based on that. Like if you only did that, like, well, it depends. Well, then what does it depend on? Well, it depends this. Well, then what does that tell us, right? we look at people and see them do something and we jump to a reason as to why they did it, but there's like 15 plausible reasons why they do it. I call it plausible cause analysis rather than root cause analysis. And so like, all I want to do is, well, it could be this, or this. What option could I do that would impact positively many of those choices? Because I still don't know why. Like, we don't know, it's unknown as to why this domino has fallen or what might happen next. But okay, if there's 7 things it could be, what's the approach we could take that would give us some success with the largest number of those plausible reasons? And then you got a better shot. And you might be able to do that again. It's that very simple example I used at the very beginning. Maybe email, maybe I should just walk down the hall and see them.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. So it's the cue. It's having a cue in my own head that says, wait, what else should I consider?
Consider the context. Think about what
right.
I might do to flex or whatever.
Right. Okay. Perfect. Kevin, fabulous conversation. The book again, Kevin Eikenberry is my guest today. Flexible Leadership. Navigate uncertainty and lead with confidence. Tons of flexors in there. If you're looking for any version of flexibility, agility, anti-fragility, I recommend starting here. It's a great place. Thanks, Kevin. Love talking to you today.
Bye. Thanks, Wanda.
All right, join us next week for another episode in Getting Out of Your Comfort Zone.
Thank you for joining us today. Tune in for another edition next week with Dr. Wanda Wallace on the Voice America Business Channel. Reach outside your comfort zone this week.